Hey, I'm Alex from Last Climb, and today I'm uncovering the ascent where Sherpa guides realized a group of TikTok trekkers was heading into a lethal situation, but they refused to turn back. Overconfidence from lower altitude experience and a filming mindset overrode guide warnings until the mountain made the final call. What it cost and what came after changed everything that followed. It was May 18, 2019, above 16,400 feet in the Khumbu Valley. The air held a stillness where sound faded quickly, voices flattened, and even footsteps on rock seemed to disappear before they finished. Light arrived before heat at this altitude, and on most days, warmth never fully followed. Ryan Cardama was 23, from Central Texas, where the highest nearby elevation reached about 1,800 feet. He worked in warehouse logistics, structured, routine-driven work, and had framed the Nepal trip to coworkers almost entirely around the footage he expected to capture: glaciers, ridgelines, and light across snowfields rather than the demands of sustained altitude. Derek Sargent, 22, from California's Central Valley, handled the group's technical side: cameras, lenses, storage, and workflow. He was precise with what he knew, but less aware of what he didn't. He spent time reviewing shot lists before the trip. The acclimatization guidelines in the same folder received less attention. That detail stopped me cold when I found it. Marcus Chervy, 24, from the Tampa Bay area, positioned himself as the group's most experienced outdoorsman. He had completed multi-day hikes in the American Southeast and maintained strong physical fitness, but had no meaningful exposure to elevations above 10,000 feet. The Smoky Mountains top out around 6,600 feet, an elevation that does not prepare the body for the 16,000-foot conditions of the Khumbu. The difference is fundamental, not gradual, and confidence built at lower altitude does not transfer. As expected, I've covered enough of these stories to know that confidence is almost always the first thing that gets people into trouble. Not recklessness, just misplaced confidence. The three had connected through the online outdoor content space, building a modest audience around accessible, visually driven trekking videos, where relatability, not technical expertise, was the focus. Nepal had been planned for 8 months around shot lists, gear, and posting schedules, with little emphasis on acclimatization. The Everest Base Camp route was treated as manageable by default, even though adaptation to altitude, not fitness, is what determines most outcomes on this trail. Pre-departure materials outlined these risks, but they were not treated as a central constraint in planning. The flight to Lukla at 9,380 feet marked an immediate shift into an environment the body was not yet prepared for. The group spent one night in Lukla before beginning the approach toward Namche Bazaar, the primary hub village of the Khumbu region, situated at approximately 11,286 feet. This remained within standard expedition planning, but already reflected the faster end of typical acclimatization, pacing for arrivals from low elevation. This was still within normal expedition planning, but already at the faster end of standard acclimatization, pacing for arrivals from low elevation. The walk from Lukla to Namche takes most trekking groups 2 days, with the second day involving a sustained climb of roughly 2,600 feet. The first significant physical test of the route. The Sherpa guides assigned to the group by the trekking operator were experienced. On this route, guides are not there to introduce technical difficulty, but to manage risk that emerges from physiology and decision-making rather than terrain alone. Between them, they had accumulated years of work on the Khumbu routes, including multiple seasons supporting commercial trekking groups of varying fitness, levels, and preparation quality. They were not technical mountaineers leading rope descents of difficult peaks. The Everest Base Camp route does not require that, but they were deeply familiar with the terrain, the weather patterns, the physiological warning signs that altitude produces in unacclimatized trekkers, and the behavioral patterns that tend to precede problems. I've seen how that familiarity shows up early in the way groups move through the lower sections of a route. Within the first day of walking, they had begun to form an assessment of the group. The assessment was not alarming at that stage. It was observational. The three young men were fit enough to move at a reasonable pace on the lower sections of trail. They were enthusiastic, which was common. They stopped frequently to film, a pattern common among content-focused trekkers that had grown substantially in recent years. What the guides noted was that these stops were not functioning as recovery. They involved repositioning, equipment adjustments, and reviewing footage on small screens before movement resumed. Each interruption served the content rather than physiological rest, and the pattern did not change as elevation increased. What was less visible to the group, and rarely explained in detail in standard briefing materials, was the decision threshold that guides use to determine when observation becomes intervention. On paper, acclimatization schedules and pacing plans exist as structured guidelines. In practice, Sherpa guides operate on a continuum of escalation rather than a single trigger point. There is no single symptom, stop, or missed meal that automatically forces a group to halt. Instead, decisions are based on whether multiple small deviations begin to converge into a sustained pattern of physiological and behavioral decline. The first threshold is usually operational drift, pace slowing beyond itinerary expectations, or repeated compression of rest intervals that begins to alter the planned timing between villages. At this stage, the default response is still verbal correction, reminders about hydration, spacing, and tempo, because early drift is common and often reversible. I've seen this stage play out often enough to recognize how unremarkable it looks in the moment. Nothing feels wrong, even as the structure of the day quietly starts to loosen. The second threshold is accumulation without correction, where issues like inconsistent intake, delayed arrivals, and repeated pauses begin reinforcing each other rather than appearing isolated. At this stage, guides typically move from reminders to more explicit instruction, adjusting spacing or adding enforced rest, without fully stopping progress. A full intervention, such as slowing the itinerary or holding a group in place, is reserved for when physiological signs align with behavioral drift, including persistent headaches, coordination changes, or cognitive lapses, affecting basic judgment. In this case, the guides remained in the middle range of that spectrum, as the concerns, slower timing, reduced intake, intermittent confusion, still had plausible altitude-related explanations and had not yet reached the threshold for overriding the itinerary. Guides are rarely responding to a single clear indicator. They are interpreting clusters of behavior that only gain meaning once they begin to persist over time. So, the situation remained in a managed state, corrected, monitored, and noted, but not escalated. In my view, I'm not looking at any one signal in isolation. I'm tracking patterns, small shifts in pace, intake, attention, and watching how they repeat, overlap, and reinforce each other until they stop behaving like coincidence and start forming something more consistent. The gap between observation and intervention in this kind of environment is rarely about awareness. It is about how long a pattern can remain ambiguous before it becomes operationally undeniable. And by the time ambiguity resolves into certainty at altitude, the available margin for correction is often already reduced. Hydration and nutrition followed the same structure, inconsistent intake that never fully adjusted as altitude increased. The guides raised concerns early, but while the issue was acknowledged, it did not translate into sustained behavioral change. The shortfall accumulated steadily as exertion increased and oxygen availability decreased. Namche Bazaar sits in a natural amphitheater carved into the hillside above the Dud Koshi River Valley. Its buildings arranged in a rough semicircle that faces south and catches afternoon sun. It is a busy place by Khumbu standards, a hub for trekking logistics, equipment rental, food resupply, and informal information exchange between groups moving through the same narrow corridor toward the higher route. The tea houses in Namche are warmer and better supplied than those higher on the route. The altitude is significant but not yet severe, and most trekkers who will encounter problems further up still feel in Namche that they are managing well. The standard acclimatization protocol at Namche calls for a rest day, or more precisely, an acclimatization day, during which trekkers are encouraged to make a short ascent to a higher elevation, and then return to sleep at Namche's altitude. The physiological principle behind this is well established. The body adapts more effectively when exposed to higher elevations during the day and allowed to recover at a lower sleeping elevation at night. It's one of those rules that sounds straightforward until you're actually there, because it quietly depends on patience more than effort. The phrase used in most trekking literature is climb high, sleep low. It is simple, widely applied, and depends on time that does not contribute to forward progress. The group spent the required time in Namche, the Trekking operators' itinerary included the acclimatization day, but it was not used in the way the protocol intended. They completed the short ascent as required, but most of the remaining time was spent around the tea house area reviewing footage, organizing files, and continuing the same content workflow that had defined the journey from the start. The movement intended to stimulate adaptation was completed, but recovery, rest, hydration, and reduced exertion remained secondary rather than central. Forward progress was achieved. Full acclimatization was not. The guidance was understood clearly at every stage. The issue was not recognition, but consistency in implementation. Recommendations were acknowledged, but not translated into sustained behavioral change. At sea level, that gap is minor. At altitude, it becomes consequential. From that point forward, the route stopped behaving as a sequence of independent decisions and instead followed an established pattern. Under increasing physiological stress, each stage did not introduce entirely new failures so much as amplify conditions already in place. Above Namche, the route passes through a series of villages, Tengboche, Dingboche, Lobuche, each at progressively higher elevation, each requiring its own adjustment period, each offering familiar warning signs to those who know how to read them. The landscape changes in character, vegetation thins and disappears. The trail moves into moraine fields. Accumulated debris of glacial movement, loose rock, gravel, and occasional large boulders deposited without order across the terrain. This is where the route stops feeling like a trail in the conventional sense and starts behaving more like an environment that must be continuously interpreted rather than simply walked through. The paths are well marked by the standards of high-altitude trekking, but they are not engineered in the way that lower elevation trails are. They follow the terrain rather than shaping it. They require attention. Here, I've learned that clear doesn't always mean easy to follow, especially when the ground itself is uneven enough that every step still has to be actively chosen. The group moved through this section over several days at a pace that, by distance alone, appeared consistent with the itinerary, but distance was not the limiting factor. Altitude response depends on time, fuel, hydration, and cumulative stress. And on all of those measures, the group was gradually falling behind. One detail the guides later emphasized was that the group's daily timing began to drift despite leaving on schedule. Above 13,000 feet, they were arriving later than expected with increasing consistency. The explanation wasn't a single factor. It was the accumulation of unregistered interruptions, short gear adjustments that turned into recovery pauses, breath breaks that lengthened slightly without being classified as rest, and repeated stops that were not treated as deviations. Over time, these fragments did not change the route on paper, but they steadily reduced how much uninterrupted movement the body was actually performing each day. The headaches began above 13,000 feet, which is not unusual at that elevation. Mild headache is among the earliest responses to reduced oxygen availability, and in isolation, it does not signal acute danger. The standard response is hydration, rest, and monitoring for escalation. In this case, the symptoms were treated as background discomfort rather than a condition requiring adjustment to pace or behavior. They continued filming through them, sometimes referencing the headache directly on camera without altering the structure of the day. That distinction becomes critical. Symptoms that are not acted on stop functioning as signals. Cognitive strain began to show in repetition rather than confusion. The same information, trail direction, distance, orientation, would be requested. Again after short intervals, not out of disagreement, but because it did not retain long enough under exertion to carry forward. Guides would provide clarification, movement would resume, and then the same questions would reappear in slightly altered form. It wasn't disorientation in the overt sense, but a narrowing of working certainty, where previously stable information required repeated confirmation. Cardama mentioned his headache in a short clip, filmed somewhere above Tengboche, framing it as part of the experience and evidence of the challenge they were undertaking. The clip was uploaded that evening. That detail stood out more than most. The appetite suppression that accompanies altitude exposure is also well documented, and begins to affect most trekkers somewhere in the 12,000 to 14,000 foot range. The body, under hypoxic stress, redirects resources in ways that reduce the sensation of hunger, even as caloric demand increases. The result is a physiological trap. The body needs more fuel precisely when it is least inclined to seek it. Managing this requires deliberate, scheduled eating, consuming food at regular intervals regardless of hunger signals, prioritizing calorie-dense intake, and treating nutrition as a functional requirement rather than a response to appetite. The group's eating pattern was not structured in this way from the beginning of the trek, and it did not become more structured as altitude increased. Meals were sometimes skipped for early departures, and snack intake remained inconsistent throughout the route. The caloric deficit did not appear dramatic on any single day, but it accumulated steadily as altitude increased and exertion demands grew. The guides raised the concern and saw only minor adjustment in response, with behavior largely unchanged through the upper sections of the trek. Their role was advisory rather than supervisory, and while the issue was clearly communicated, there was no mechanism to enforce compliance. What stands out in hindsight is how often acknowledgement gets mistaken for action. They did not ignore the guidance, they simply never fully reorganized their behavior around it. At sea level, that gap is usually harmless. At altitude, it compounds. Coordination changes at altitude are subtle in their early stages. Slightly delayed steps, reduced responsiveness to pacing signals, and less precise movement over uneven terrain. Above 14,000 feet, these shifts remained individually explainable, which made the broader pattern difficult to recognize in real time. The group continued on the momentum of its plan rather than adjusting to what the conditions were progressively showing. I keep returning to that idea, not because it describes a single mistake, but because it describes how decisions behave when nothing forces them to change. Beyond Dingboche and toward Lobouche, the pattern continued without meaningful adjustment. The terrain grew more complex, wider. Moraine fields, narrower paths, and unstable surfaces where gravel often concealed underlying ice. Sections that appeared straightforward required constant attention, with sudden transitions and reduced margin for error. On May 18th, under typical pre-monsoon conditions, temperatures in the upper 20s to 30s, Fahrenheit and steady wind across exposed ridges, the group departed before 6 in the morning, maintaining the same filming-driven pace that had defined the trek from the start, capturing footage during the hours when the sun was low and the shadows were long. Breakfast on the morning of May 18th was minimal, according to tea house staff. Another small decision that, in isolation, would not matter, but at altitude rarely exists in isolation for long. Fixed ropes were installed along this traverse, anchored at intervals to provide balance and stability. They were not designed to stop a full fall, but to assist controlled movement, something manageable under normal conditions, but far less reliable for someone already physically and cognitively compromised. For a person in compromised physical condition, dehydrated, calorically depleted, operating under the cognitive effects of sustained hypoxic exposure, the same crossing requires something the body may no longer be fully able to provide. The group reached the narrow traverse section in the mid-morning. The guides were positioned in the standard configuration for a rope-assisted crossing, one ahead of the group to demonstrate the line and monitor the anchor points, one behind to observe and assist. The guides later described the group's movement in the approach to the traverse as showing the characteristics they had been observing for several days in more pronounced form. Foot placement was less deliberate than it had been in the lower sections of the route. Response to verbal pacing signals was slower than it should have been. The rhythm of movement that experienced trekkers develop on technical terrain was inconsistent. None of this was, at the moment of observation, a definitive indicator that something was about to go wrong. It was a collection of small signals, each individually explainable, that together formed a pattern the guides recognized. By the approach to the traverse, the same concerns had already been raised multiple times without meaningful behavioral change. It wasn't any single mistake that stood out. It was how familiar the whole pattern already felt once it started repeating in slightly different forms. The sequence of events that followed was reconstructed from the accounts of the Sherpa guides and from the physical evidence of the terrain. It unfolded over a period of seconds. One member of the group made an adjustment to the camera equipment being carried during the crossing. The adjustment involved a shift in body position at a point on the traverse where the trail surface was narrowest, and the fixed rope required steady, consistent tension to function as intended. The shift in position moved weight distribution away from the optimal center of gravity alignment that the crossing required. The foot that bore the redistributed weight came down on a section of trail surface where loose gravel overlaid a thin ice crust. The gravel, under the change weight distribution, shifted. Everything that came before, every skipped meal, every filming pause, every ignored recommendation, it all converged in that 1 second. The ice beneath it offered no friction. The foot moved. The fixed rope arrested the initial movement. but the arrest transferred load along the rope system, and the load transfer reached the other members of the group who were on the line at the same moment. In hypoxic conditions, with compromised reaction time and reduced balance correction ability, the response to an unexpected load transfer on a fixed line requires a speed and precision of physical response that the body, under the conditions the group had been operating in for the preceding days, could not reliably produce. The second loss of footing followed within seconds of the first. The third followed the second. At that point, what stands out to me isn't just how fast it unfolded, but how little room there actually is for correction once the system is already under strain. The guides moved immediately, but the terrain below the traverse did not allow a clean arrest once movement began. The same gravel over ice surface that triggered the slip extended into the section where counterforce would have been needed, and the speed of the sequence exceeded what could be physically stopped. What followed wasn't a single fall, but a broken descent across staggered ledges, compacted ice, and loose rock, breaking the movement into uneven stages, forcing separation as each person followed a different line through the terrain. The guides pushed down after them at once, but the same ground conditions that prevented control from above also slowed any attempt to close the distance from below. A separate trekking party on a parallel section of the route heard the disturbance and altered course. By the time the guides reached the first member of the group, approximately 12 minutes had passed since the initial slip. Ground response was initiated within minutes by the Sherpa guides and nearby trekking personnel. The trekking operator's emergency contact in Kathmandu was notified that same afternoon. Helicopter evacuation was requested but could not be executed on May 18th due to deteriorating weather and the altitude limitations affecting rotary wing operations in the upper Khumbu. Initial access and recovery were carried out on foot, with helicopter support arriving the following morning once conditions improved. Post-recovery medical assessment documented trauma consistent with multi-stage descent impacts across broken terrain at high altitude, along with acute altitude-related illness in all three individuals, significant dehydration, and caloric depletion consistent with sustained exertion without adequate intake. What the medical language does not fully capture is that each of these findings reflects a condition that developed in real time under observable circumstances with known risks already present. The official review identified physiological decline driven by inadequate hydration, insufficient caloric intake, and cumulative hypoxic exposure above 16,000 feet as a primary factor contributing to impaired coordination and delayed reaction time during the rope-assisted traverse. All three members of the group, Ryan Cardama, Derek Sargent, and Marcus Chervy, died from injuries sustained in the fall.